Well, we are the Knoxville History Project, and our mission is pretty simple. We exist to research and promote the history and culture of this city, Knoxville, Tennessee. Like always, I'd like to point out that we do record these sessions, and right now you can find the recorded ones in the portal and under podcasts and dialogues, and that is changing pretty soon. So just kind of be warned, but that's where they are right now. Also in that section, you will find our new Legends of Music History walking tour. I mentioned that last week, but we partnered with this company in South Africa, actually, called VoiceMap, voicemap.me.com. But you can search for Knoxville or nearby, pops up pretty easily. And you'll find Knoxville Legends, exploring the city's country music heritage. We're eager for people to download it, download the app and try it. It is $5.99. We get 50% of the proceeds. And it starts actually just north of the Gay Street Viaduct at a place where, as Jack likes to say, Dolly Parton first found her audience. Kind of wraps around past the Southern Station, through the Old City, back over to Gay by the Emporium building, and heads north there. Actually, that's a long stop right where the Sturkey building is, and heads back up along North Shore. I'm talking about North Shore for Gay Street, and cuts through Market Square, back over to the Holston building and Tennessee Theater, and then winds up further down Gay Street on the courthouse lawn. So encourage you to check that out and let us know what you think. If you don't want to do a tour on your own though, and you want a real person, encourage you to sign up for a tour with Laura Stell, Knoxville Walking Tours. She is raring to go, lovely weather to do an outdoor tour. But thank you to council members Lynn Fugate and Charlie Thomas producing this series. Okay, Jack, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks to Paul and Nicole. If it weren't for Paul and Nicole, I'd just be telling these stories to whoever was at the bar tonight, probably. But I'm grateful to them for being able to show these great pictures, and some of these pictures I had never seen before we assembled this presentation for this week. This is called The Seven Wonders of Ancient Knoxville, and this is sort of a version of a piece I wrote for Metropulse several years ago, but I've learned a good deal more about these places that I was just kind of sketching back then. And glad you're here to share some of this. We're talking about seven things, seven really remarkable things, mostly buildings, one not a building that we'll be talking about that are not there anymore. That's one of the defining principles of this. So don't, if you know of a thing that's still there, we're not going to be talking about it tonight, because we're talking about stuff that's not there anymore. Staub's Opera House is one of the oldest ones in the series, and Staub's Opera House was established in 1872 by a guy named Peter Staub, who was, you probably wouldn't name your opera house Staub's unless that was your name, and that was his name. He was a Swiss immigrant and came over here as part of that massive movement of European refugees who came here in the mid-19th century after the revolutions of the 1840s. Landed in Tennessee and first had this idealistic idea to have kind of a community for Swiss refugees in America. And he established this town called Grootley in kind of in the southern part of the Cumberlands in Tennessee, and not too far from where Bonnaroo is held. Grootley Lager is called today. This is going to be an idyllic community for Swiss refugees. And like a lot of other European utopian communities in the Cumberlands, it didn't work out as he hoped. People got there, it was cold, there wasn't anything to do, it was hard to farm, it was nothing very good about it, and a lot of people got angry at him, and he kind of retreated to a city called Knoxville, which was just recovering from the war, and apparently got some money together and decided to make a big splash here and built Staub's Opera House, which was a pretty impressive edifice there on Gay Street. This was on the corner of the southeast corner of Gay Street and Cumberland Avenue. This is where the Plaza Tower is today. Staub's built this place in 1872. The first show we ever did there was a Swiss show, a story about the great hero of Switzerland, William Tell. I think that was just kind of a symbolic entry to this. It was very popular. This was Knoxville's biggest and most popular auditorium for many, many years. At its height, it held almost 2,000 people, but was kind of an impressive piece of work, in that very popular sort of Second Empire style that was popular in France at the time. Was designed by Joseph Bowman or Bauman, as he might have pronounced it. His descendants pronounced the name Bowman, but he grew up with a German family and might have pronounced it Bauman. But he was the founder of what became Bowman Brothers and later Bowman and Bowman. I think he was just working by himself at this time in 1872, and he was the principal architect for Staub's Opera House. It was called an opera house, and they had several operas there. A lot of people have told me that they'd never really had a real opera there, but I've found lots of descriptions of them, a couple dozen anyway. Victor Herbert, the operetta composer, was there for one of the music festivals of the 1880s. Emma Uke, who is a well-known soprano from Europe, was there. Much later on, the famous singer Marian Anderson, who was performed there in the 1920s, about 10 years before they forbade her to perform at a chosen location in Washington. Because she was African American, but she was 10 years before that, she was singing at Staub's for a mixed race audience. It had all sorts of things going on there. They had opera festivals there, and I love the story that in 1883, and we tell the story on the Country Music app. In 1883, there was kind of a prank on the opera festival that year, that a bunch of guys got up there at the very end of the festival, and for this seated audience wearing tuxedos, they began playing old-time fiddle tunes. And this may well be the first country music concert in history. I haven't found an earlier one anyway. The idea of playing music on a stage for a seated audience, that was not done that much. That you played this kind of music for barn dances and stuff, not for audiences. But that was a distinction that Staub's had. But mainly what it did on a regular basis was they had vaudeville. They had all sorts of vaudeville. They had Broadway shows too. Among the people who performed at Staub's were Lily Langtry, Sarah Bernhardt, the four Cohans, including George M. Cohan, and some old timers used to remember that they looked forward to every new season, because every new season, starting in the fall, when it reopened after being closed in the summertime, the first show was always W.C. Fields as a young man performing his juggling and comedy act on stage at Staub's. But they also had lectures there. I think George Washington Cable was there once, but also the most famous person who ever lectured there was Frederick Douglass, the former enslaved, the guy who escaped from slavery, who later wrote about his experiences and became a major abolitionist. Spoke there in 1880. But it was Knoxville's main auditorium. UT graduations were there for many years when there weren't any auditoriums that big on UT campus. It was very important to the city. As our friend Paul Brown found out, it was the site of and is anybody that has read our donors of $50 a year and more get a connection to a column that we write every month. And this month we wrote about the guy that wrote Big Dark County Mountain, whose name was Haywire Mack, Harry McClintock. But I'd always heard stories that his father was killed in an accident at Staub's. His father was helping remodel Staub's and fell from one of the upper balconies and plummeted to his death. And I had looked for this back in the 1890s, thinking, based on other clues about McClintock's life, that this was when it happened. But this was as Paul Brown found, it was discovered. It happened in 1901. That his Harry McClintock's father, Walter, died in an accident, and Harry McClintock left town soon after that and kind of went on the road to seek his fame and fortune as a songwriter, and did had a very unusual career. But you can look up that column if you want to. But anyway, we have an interior shot, don't we? It was called the Lyric Theater in the 19 I think around the time of World War One. Changed it to Lyric Theater. Keith Vaudeville was a series of like a vaudeville network. You got a certain kind of vaudeville when you went to a Keith Vaudeville theater. But the interior was amazing. This is the interior of Staub's Opera House, Staub's Theater, later called the Lyric Theater. It had 3 balconies, and just look at that capacity there. I don't know what this occasion is. If anybody out there knows, this looks like circa 1930, and it looks like an almost all-female audience. I don't know what they might be gathered there to witness, but it was pretty impressive audience. They're not filling the third balcony up there, but it's like a classic European opera house in some ways, but an impressive place. Later on, in the same room, the very same room that had Victor Herbert and Marian Anderson and Frederick Douglass and all these people, they were having live country music shows for WNOX. This was when they had a really big show, the big barn dance, not the midday merry-go-round, which was in a smaller theater, but the big barn dances, which were on Saturday nights. They had here in the 1940s and early 50s. There was some a little story in the Ken Burns story about country music about Chet Atkins joining the Carter sisters on stage, and that was kind of a turning point in all of their careers. But that happened here at Staub's Opera House in circa 1948, I think it was, for a live radio show. But they're also, by this time they were also having wrestling and things like that. So it was kind of seeing. It didn't have the same kind of crowd that they had before, and then it was a bit run down in the mid 1950s. It could have been saved, I'm sure, but I don't think there was enough will for that at the time. Everybody was staying home and watching TV. And we had a couple of other theaters anyway, and somebody purchased the Lyric Theater and tore it down to build a department store that was never built. That was the Miller's Company was going to build their new modern Miller's here. And when Rich's opened across town and then closed, Miller said, "Why don't we just move into the Rich's place instead of building this new place that we tore down a theater for?" But it was just empty. It was just a parking lot for about 20 years until Jake Butcher came along and built his bank there in the late 1970s. The tallest building, I think to this day, tallest building in East Tennessee stands on this site, the Plaza Tower. All right, that's Staub/Lyric. It's quite a long story, 80 years of entertainment and education and political rallies and graduations and everything else there, but something that not many people remember. If you remember, some people do remember Staub's or the Lyric, and if you do, I'd like to hear from you either tonight or later. But anyway, let's look at the next one, Paul. All right, this is the Vendome. This is the building that looks like a vision of sorts. The image on the left is an early image that I think was on display in some show windows in a department store in downtown in 1889. They were showing up what they were about to build here. The architect was Beaver and Hoffmeister. There was a guy from Dayton, Ohio, who moved here to do work in this rapidly growing city of Knoxville, named Leonidas Beaver, and some people thought he was French because he could speak French. I don't know. I don't believe that he was born in France, but an interesting guy I would like to know more about. It kind of a mysterious fellow, but was considered kind of an architectural genius. Designed the Vendome and a few other things in town. He had designed the Dayton Courthouse, by the way, back in Ohio before he came here. But this was a hotel in the early days. It was a luxury hotel with different plans for different kinds of stays. And it was actually run by two different factions. One was a guy named W.J. Berg, who was from Louisville. He was a well-known caterer and hotel guy who came here and was excited about this project, the Vendome, and he was going to be the manager of it. But he shared managership in an unusual way with a group called the Bayless Burns group, which was led by a Dr. H.G. Bayless. But this was built and finished in very early 1890. It had by some accounts it had 100 rooms in it, but they were divided into different suites, so probably 50 to 60 different suites with different rooms. It had, according to the news reports, a lot of plumbing. A lot of buildings back then didn't even have plumbing. This had 6 miles of plumbing, 6 miles of plumbing for the one hotel, Vendome. It had what was described as an elegant hydraulic elevator. Elevators were very unusual at this time. I'm not utterly sure this is the first one, but I bet it was the first elevator in Knoxville. And they had the lobby they had a magnificent marble fireplace and mantle. They had all sorts of very modern amenities of a hotel in those days. They had a grand opening in January of 1890, and it was kind of crippled by the fact, and I want to mention this today, that there was an epidemic afoot. It was an influenza epidemic, or la grippe, as they called it back then, and a lot of people were not able to attend the grand opening that January. But it was a very big deal. About 50 to 60 invited guests did show up, and they were the most interesting people in Knoxville at the time. There was the industrialist W.P. Chamberlain, Peter Kern, famous, well known today, and he was actually mayor at the time. Our last German-born mayor, our last mayor with a German accent, was Peter Kern. But also E.T. Sanford, future U.S. Supreme Court Justice, was among the people who attended. Joshua Caldwell, a very literary lawyer. M.L. Ross, the candy maker. William Rule, the former the Union veteran who had also been mayor, but also was best known as a journalist, a longtime editor of the Journal. But all these interesting people were all there together and to enjoy a 2-hour meal served in courses. In a French cafe at the very top, including that turret, was a French cafe, which was where they say splendid music was furnished by a string band. But they had something called Lynnhaven en coquilles, which I think may have been some sort of a oyster on a half shell dish, prepared by the house chef, whose name was Henri Donnet, was a French chef, who also served them for dessert café mocha à la Françoise. If people were just used to drinking Knoxville coffee in those days, they might have been drinking something like we drink in cafes today. As they described it, it was just such a big night, and people got carried away describing the place. This was roughly 6 stories tall. They said this palatial structure has reared its head almost into the clouds. This was about as tall a building as we had ever built in Knoxville, and about this time, and it was built entirely in masonry. There was no steel reinforcement. You really couldn't. It was dangerous to build much taller than this without steel reinforcement. Skyscrapers were just around the corner. But anyway, it was, I think that might have been its finest moment that night that it opened with the French chef. Looking into the must to come, this is maybe the first demonstration of people in Knoxville getting involved in things out of town and to such an extent that it draws energy away from Knoxville. And that happened in Middlesboro, Kentucky, which was a town founded by a Knoxvillian and in the late 1880s, was kind of a industrial utopia. It was kind of famous around the world. People were wanting to come to Middlesbrough, Kentucky, because there's going to be this great surge of industry there, everything modern and everything luxurious for the investors, at least, who went there. We had a railroad to Middlesbrough at this time, so it was a big deal. A lot of Knoxvillians were going up there, some to just see the place, and some to find work. And actually, Mr. Berg, the guy that had opened the Vendome, got distracted by Middlesbrough, which he thought was going to be a great new thing, and moved there with his wife. And meanwhile, began having a dispute with Dr. Bayless, his partner in this project, and they sued each other. And Berg got out of it altogether. Bayless ran the place, but he didn't have the experience with catering that Berg had. And I kind of think that it began to decline not too long after it opened, although it was considered a very nice place to live for quite a few years after that. It was a place where all the state Supreme Court justices stayed in the late 1890s and early 1900s when they were in town. Thomas Lanier Williams was a lawyer who ran for office. He ran for governor a few times, was a well-known Democratic politician, if not a very successful one. He did find a state post to made a nice living for himself. But after his wife died at a very young age, and he had 3 kids to raise, he farmed them out to private schools and lived at the Vendome. The reason I'm mentioning him, if you study, if you know the history of Broadway and its playwrights very well, you know the name of Tennessee Williams, and you may know his real name is also Thomas Lanier Williams. This was his grandfather. Tennessee Williams' grandfather lived in this hotel for a couple of years at least. A woman, Dr. Kate Callahan, one of our first female physicians in town, lived there. Reverend Robert Bachman, a well-known and influential Presbyterian minister, lived there. And also, for a short time at least, Dr. David and Ella Williams, who were the parents of Miss Eugenia Williams, who later built her extravagant house on Lions View, which we're giving tours of once a month. If you want to take one of our tours, go to the Aslan Foundation and sign up for it. We're doing two tours a month. But her father and mother, after they got married, very elaborate wedding in 1897 or so, lived at the Vendome. But it was a stylish place to be, and I mentioned earlier. I talked about this when I found out about it some 25 years ago. I began mentioning it in talks, and calling it the Vendome, and I was corrected by a sweet old lady who remembered the place about 25 years ago, and she said, honey, we everyone called it the Vendome, and it's named for the Place Vendome in Paris. So I've never made that mistake again. It's just the Vendome, and it was very French, and with a French chef and perhaps an architect with French connections. Here's a really rare photograph of it on a kind of a skyline picture, looking from the, there it is. Paul's putting the arrow around it, looking toward the northeast, down from hovering over near where the UT Conference Center is, perhaps down there. It's not as tall, doesn't tower over the buildings as it did when it was built in 1890. This is in the late 1920s probably, and but it's still visible there, and it was kind of it'd seen better days by this time. It was an apartment building. It was only 35 years old at this time, but was no longer the most fashionable place in town to live. It was old fashioned. It was Victorian. It was very, very 1890. Those domes are all, strictly about 1888 to 1890 is about the only time we built buildings with domes here. But it, a lot of people just looked old fashioned and unfashionable. But anyway, and it was vacated. It was the subject of some kind of an estate, and people were trying to liquidate the estate. in 1941 and decided the best thing to do was just to tear it down, and they did tear it down in early 1942. And there were a few regrets expressed, but no big preservation effort to try to save it. But interesting building that architects know about, and sometimes I've seen drawings of new buildings proposed for the area that architects have some reflection of the old Vendome in them. But anyway, that's a place I wish I could have seen. And if you know anyone, I think you probably have to be close to 100 to have a good memory of the Vendome. But if you are like that, we want to hear from you. All right, the next one is very different. It's a story of an inventor who built a remarkable house. I want to talk about Weston Fulton for just a little bit. He's a guy who was very well known, very famous in Knoxville, one of the most famous Knoxvillians of about 100 years ago. He was famous for having invented something that he called the Silphon. Weston Fulton was came here basically as a weatherman. He ran the weather bureau downtown. And as a young man, one of his jobs was to report the river levels. And of course, if your office is, I think it was in a custom house or somewhere around there, if your office is up on top of the bluff where downtown is, it's a pain to have to go down all the way down, slide down the hill every day and then climb back up 65 feet or so from the river level up to the rest of downtown. And he came up just out of laziness, came up with this ingenious device that would help register water level and relay it electronically to where his office was. And this was something that he called the Silphon. And he realized that this might have many other applications. The Silphon was a flexible metal bellows, and it could be tiny, it could be huge. But Silphons were immediately, he found useful in all sorts of things, and all sorts of gauges, but including the gauges that made depth charges work in World War I. He found there was so much demand for this thing that he built a plant, the Fulton Plant, which was just on it was exactly where University Commons is now. In fact, University Commons looks a little bit like the Fulton Plant. It was still there until about 15 years ago. It was owned by a European company that I don't think ever considered the idea of trying to save it. It was an interesting old building, but he made Silphons there, or just bellows as they eventually became known. I think the name Silphon died with Mr. Fulton, but did extremely well. This was a big company that it sometimes, like especially during wartime, had as many as 3,000 employees working for him there. But anyway, he was one of the wealthiest people in Knoxville. Certainly had millions of dollars. He lived in a nice house near UT campus, but in 1929. He wanted to build something special, kind of this fantasy house, and he hired the architect Charlie Barber to help him with it. And Charlie Barber loved kind of playing with old-fashioned styles, so we built this mansion we're about to see a picture of. This is it. This is the Fulton Mansion that was built on Lions View, and it was he called it Westcliff, and this was his where his family lived from 1929 until the late 40s. This was a remarkable place. It was as they were finishing it, though, it was tinged with a bit of tragedy. His son, whose name was Weston Fulton Jr., was killed in a car wreck. He had just signed up to be a freshman at UT at age 17 only. Was killed in a car wreck on Kingston Pike, and so it was very melancholy occasion as they were moving into the house that they had just lost their son. They had a couple of daughters. They still had a family to live here, but they moved into this house, which is kind of a fascinating combination of a little bit bizarre combination of styles of Spanish and kind of Moorish and Arabian sorts of styles. Some people said it looked like it was designed by P.T. Barnum, or like Douglas Fairbanks, perhaps. It almost has some Hollywood to it. And it's interesting that one of the most high-profile weddings in Knoxville history was held here in 1937, when they'd lived here for about 8 years. Barbara Fulton, his beautiful daughter, and talented daughter, she had been working in Broadway in New York, and had met a fellow Broadway actor, and and she'd done some Hollywood work as well. Made a couple very short movies and little things here, come around the edges of Hollywood. But she got married to a fellow Broadway actor, and in 1937, and this was one of the highest profile weddings in Knoxville history, Barbara Fulton's wedding. And it was invitation only, but there were, hundreds of people, including Broadway people were down here, Hollywood people. It was a huge social event in 1937, and it kind of goes to show that a big wedding doesn't necessarily suggest a big marriage. She was back here again just 3 years later, in a much smaller, more modest way, getting married to another guy. So it was, but it was still a good place for a wedding, whether it was big or small. Anyway, Barbara Fulton, by the way, was later on involved in Barbara Gentry, her name was, later involved in drama events at the Carousel and Clarence Brown. Here's that turret on the top, that fascinating turret on the top. And from up here, one of the rumors about the Fulton Mansion was that from the top of the mansion, you could see Highland Memorial Cemetery, where their son was buried. And their son is buried on a very stylish, as you would expect, a very stylish, circa 1929 monument down there, and kind of over in the western part of the cemetery. But the rumor was that, I think I was a small child when I heard this, was that the Fultons shone a light from the top, from this tower, all the way over to the Highland Memorial Cemetery. And this might have been the sort of thing that might appeal to Fulton, the inventor who was playing with electronics all the time. But members of his family have assured me that is not true. However, you could, if you had a nice telescope, you could at least see your son's grave from up on the top of the house here. This house was the Fulton's home until his death in 1946, and it was, as we've mentioned before, it was a setting for a unusual color Snow White movie that was locally made, an amateur project, but surprisingly well done. The filmmaker went around picking the most exotic locations, and Fulton was a natural for this. But after they left it, it was sold to a guy who thought about trying to use it as a tourist place. This was at a time that the Dixie Highway was bringing thousands of tourists down Kingston Pike, and he was thinking about maybe having a tourist hotel at the Fulton Mansion. I never really got that off the ground. And by the way, this is the entrance that you may recognize. This building is still there. It's on Lions View. This is the old guardhouse, the gatehouse, and actually part of the foundation of the Fulton Mansion is still intact. My dad took me up through these gates one time when they were open in the 60s, when the Fulton Mansion was still there, and had a good look at it. But after this attempt to open a tourist hotel up there didn't work out for financial reasons, I think, and the next occupants were even more interesting. They were nuns. They were nuns who worked at St. Mary's Hospital, and they needed a nunnery, a convent. Basically, they made a convent of the Fulton Mansion for a few years, and this was a place where nuns who lived at St. Mary's lived. And they eventually, of course, built a place much closer to the hospital to live in. But this was, I think, the first introduction of Catholicism to this place that 50 years later would have the cathedral, the Sacred Heart Cathedral, is just not much more than a stone's throw from here. But anyway, the building was finally torn down in the 1960s, I think 1967 or so, and at which time they built the Westcliff condominiums up there, which are named for the mansion that was the name that Fulton gave the mansion when he built it back in 1929. All right, the next one's back downtown again. And this is something pretty surprising if you look at old images of bird's eye views of Knoxville. The girls' high school, this palatial high school that looks like much more than a high school, doesn't it? This was on Union Avenue, and it was exactly where the Daylight Building is now. If you know Union Avenue Books is right there. This was originally the girls' high school. This was built in 1885, designed by Bowman Brothers. Joseph Bowman, the same guy that had designed Staub's Opera House several years earlier, was the lead architect on this, and built by a well-known contractor, Reps Jones. It was described as elegant and convenient. It was at a time when boys had a school that was called Hampton Sydney. It had been a private school, became a public school, but they built this much more elaborate public high school for girls over here on the other side of town, and it was but it's interesting that the boys attending, here we go, and right in the middle you see the letter F is on top of the girls' high school, and this is my first image of this. I'd never seen this before. I saw this bird's eye view from 1886. I thought, gosh, what is that palace just near Market Square? Because right nearby there you can see the old Market House that was there before the Market House that some people remember. But that's Market Square over there, and this is the girls' high school just a block and a half away. But it was a fascinating story. But they, for some reason, boys started attending girls' high school too, even though it's still called girls' high school. And it's kind of surprising to see boys in pictures of graduating classes of girls' high school. And one of those boys, and it was that way until I think they just started calling it Knoxville High School before they closed it in 1910, which is when they built the Knoxville High School on Fifth Avenue that we're familiar with, that's still there today. But one of the boys that at first attended girls' high school was a small and young for his grade guy from North Knoxville called his name was Clarence Brown, and very bright kid, was very active kid, and didn't seem to mind attending girls' high school, but it was called KHS by the time he graduated, and he and I'm trying to remember right now the name of the movie. He remembered the high school so well that he paid homage to it in a movie that he made in 1935, based on a Eugene O'Neill play. And some of you are already telling or saying the name of the movie right now, but it was All Wilderness. Yeah, I never can remember the name of that. It's the comedy. I've seen it a couple of times, but it has Mickey Rooney. It's Eugene O'Neill's only comedy, I think, and it's partly autobiographical. But Clarence Brown brought his own autobiographical aspect to the movie by designing sets for the movie that are based on his memories of girls' high school. And he actually even used a KHS banner. If you watch that movie today, Wilderness, Hollywood MGM production in 1935, the first image you see is a KHS banner, and it's actually Clarence Brown's own KHS Knoxville High School banner that he got here when he graduated from here in 1905. And was so fond of this place that you see rooms in the high school that he uses, which is actually set in New England. It's based on Eugene O'Neill's play, but the rooms are based on Clarence Brown's memories of Knoxville High School. But anyway, yeah, that's not there anymore. It became after it was vacated by Knoxville High School. It became Boyd Junior High School, and was that for a few years until it burned in 1925, and the Daylight Building was built just a couple of years after that. All right, next one, please. This is and not a very good picture of it, but this is the Fountainhead Hotel. You can't quite make it out through the trees, but the Fountainhead Hotel was a beautiful big hotel built up in Fountain City. It had I think it was 3-story places with lots of balconies. It was built in 1885. That was a great year for new things. 1885. The architects of this one were Stevenson and Gittaz, or Gittaz, I suppose his name was pronounced. He was a Swiss a guy who had actually grown up in Paris and had gone to school in Paris. And Mr. Stevenson, James Stevenson, I think his name was from England. So with 2 immigrants who the same year that they were designing the Fountainhead Hotel up in Fountain City, back when this was a resort, a Springs resort attraction for around the country. At the same time they were designing this, they were designing a much more familiar building today that's still there, I'm glad to say, the old courthouse. If you go up to the courthouse plaque, they still has the name Stevenson and Gittaz in the entryway there. But it was a 40-room resort hotel. Go out in the country, it was perfect, beautiful, fresh, clean living place to just hang out and take the waters. The waters didn't have any special properties, but people just liked the idea that the fountain, water was coming out of the rocks, and that was something kind of special. But they had a lot of other things to entertain people. They had an Italian string band led by a guy named Professor Guiliano. That played every night at 6:30, right about this time. 100 and change years ago, Professor Guiliano was entertaining us with his Italian band at the Fountainhead Hotel. They had a 3-lane bowling alley there. They had hot and cold running water and what they called electric annunciators, which I don't know if that was an alarm system or what, but anyway, the Fountainhead Hotel was popular for several years. It was one of these during the heyday of the Springs resorts, and we had several Little Springs. All of this, the Fountainhead Hotel was probably the finest of all of them, and became kind of the reason Fountain City was named Fountain City. But it was just a lovely place to visit. They had a nice park there that was. Speakers would come there. Eugene Debs, of all people, drew a big crowd at Fountain City Park, and they had the dummy line from downtown to go there. It ran all day, and you could get a round trip ticket for 15 cents, I think, to go to Fountain City and back, and maybe come back at midnight on the dummy line. But it became it had its heyday as a hotel for 25 years or so, and then became an apartment building, and then in 1918 became Dr. Gertz's Sanatorium. Dr. Gertz specialized in treatment of nervous diseases, whatever that might mean. But he ran this as a sanitarium for about 2 years until it burned down in 1920, and that was the end of the Fountainhead Hotel. By that time, there was also it was kind of an exciting place to be because there was the Holbrook Normal School, which was a teaching college that was up there as well, and it looks it kind of, I think, borrows some of the look of the Fountainhead Hotel to some degree. That was later served as Central High School. But all right, let's look at the next one. The next one is the one that's not a building. This is something other than architecture we're going to be talking about. This is the Sanford Arboretum. Alfred Sanford was from a prominent family. In fact, his brother, we mentioned briefly earlier, E.T. Sanford, was a U.S. Supreme Court justice in the 1920s. And in fact, about the time that that Alfred Sanford was visualizing this amazing arboretum. He lived on Kingston Pike at 2890. Kingston Pike was called then. I'm not sure if that's the same number now, but But anyway, he was a capitalist. He invested in industry, but also was best known as the owner of the Knoxville Journal. And to tie all this back around, one of the things that he designed or not designed, but that he built, was the Journal Arcade, where the Journal newspaper was on Gay Street. That beautiful marble building that's there today, beautiful inside and out. If you haven't seen the inside, go inside the Journal Arcade. That's the best remnant of Alfred Sanford's life in Knoxville that I know of. It was the headquarters of the Journal for some years after he built it, and even after he sold the Journal in 1929, when he began concentrating more on his home on Kingston Pike and making it a real paradise. His wife Eleanor, I think, had a lot to do with his what he wanted to do. But their idea, which I think they came up with together, they had a nice garden in the backyard, but they wanted, and they had a backyard that ran down to the river. But they thought, we can do much more with this. Let's make this an arboretum. And it was open to the public, but it was an arboretum that would have at least 300 kinds of trees in it, and they began planting trees and shrubs. That all the trees and shrubs, that was the goal. I don't know whether they actually reached this or not. The goal was to plant all the trees and shrubs that are indigenous to East Tennessee and have them in one place where you can look at them, overlooking the river, the beautiful place. And this fascinating place with that it was meant to be walked around in. And to do this, they got there are all these stories that you'll hear in Knoxville history Frederick Law Olmsted had something to do with Knoxville history, and a lot of people think that it was something to do with the Sanford Arboretum. Actually, it was not Frederick Law Olmsted, but his sons, the Olmsted brothers, that helped design this landscape that Sanford created with his wife down here. Frederick Law Olmsted was in Knoxville working on something in the 1890s. We don't know what it was. It might have been Circle Park. It might have been a big planned city park that was never really completed on the bluffs across the river. It might have been something else. We're not sure what Frederick Law Olmsted was, but the Olmsted brothers did come here in the late 1920s and helped Alfred Sanford design this arboretum, this astonishing place. And I've never seen any good pictures of this, but Paul this week found some interesting shots of a garden which we think was the beginning of the arboretum. This was his Eleanor Sanford's garden. And maybe the beginnings of this arboretum, but a beautiful color picture is probably from the late 1920s, early 30s of the Sanford backyard that led down to the river. This was the arboretum was privately owned. It was by 1931 they had 1,000 trees and shrubs planted here, and they still weren't nearly finished. But it was privately owned, but quietly open to the public. He welcomed garden clubs and journalists and other people to come. Interestingly, the Knoxville Journal, which he had recently owned, didn't have anybody that was much interested in gardening writing for them. But the News Sentinel, especially Lucy Templeton, the great columnist for the News Sentinel, wrote about the Sanford Arboretum a lot. She wrote about dozens of columns about this amazing place. And she was frustrated, though, by 1939, when it had been there for 10 years. She said she complained that it was just way too little known and too little celebrated. And she said, if you have not seen the Sanford Arboretum, go there today, because it's just a beautiful, it's the most beautiful spot in Knoxville. You've got to see it. But anyway, the family had some tragedies after this. His wife Eleanor died before he did. She died in 1942. He began suffering some health problems. He remarried to a woman named Lockett, but he went to Philadelphia for treatment of some sort of disorder. at a hospital there. And in 1946 died from a fall or perhaps a jump from the 9th floor of that hospital while he was undergoing treatment. His widow, the woman he'd been married to a fairly short time, and this is often the case, that a second spouse is not that interested in carrying on the legacy of the first spouse. She didn't have any interest in maintaining the Sanford Arboretum, and just pretty much liquidated it and sold it for real estate. And it was obviously post-war era. It was a great time to be buying property right around the Sequoia Hills area. So it was chopped up and sold. And in fact, real estate companies boasted about your backyard as part of the Sanford Arboretum. There are Sanford trees back there. And to this day, there are people who live around there on Lakeview Drive or some of the other associated drives through this area that can point to a tree and say that was a Sanford tree that's still there. But anyway, it was so the Arboretum that seemed to be that Lucy Templeton thought was going to be something Knoxville was going to be famous for, and was famous for in some circles. It was written about some outside of the area. Was only intact for maybe 15 years or so, and then just almost vanished. I'm glad there are still some trees. His house was actually torn down in 1974. His brother Hugh Sanford, though there were 3 brothers, Hugh Sanford lived very close to him, and his house is still a very interesting house. I think it was designed by Harry Lindeberg, but it's on the property of the Methodist Church, just barely down the way from the site of the Arboretum. But we're lucky the Journal Arcade is still there, and that brings up something we're going to talk about next. The astonishingly big building, which was built at Chilhowie Park in 1910. This is it's been called several things over the years, but it's been called the Liberal Arts Building, the Administration Building, the Land Building, I think, several other things over the years. That surprisingly never had a name. It's such a monumental building. And it was designed by the same guy I just mentioned, the Journal Arcade on Gay Street. It was designed by the same guy that designed the Journal Arcade. His name was R.F. Graff, G-R-A-F. He was a son of Swiss immigrants and one of our more interesting architects in the first quarter of the 20th century. He designed this thing for an exposition. This was designed for the Appalachian Exposition of 1910, for which there were lots of buildings built, just kind of exposition style buildings, all of them white. But they had all except for the coal building, which was built of coal, and I'm not sure the fine arts building. There was a fine arts building. There was a Negro building, they called it, on kind of the north part of the site, which was designed and built by black students at Knoxville College. There were lots of different things to see and do at the Appalachian Exposition, and this was the first of 3 really big expositions, the biggest of which was in 1913, the National Conservation Exposition, which was a huge thing. But Teddy Roosevelt came here to the exposition. Later on, William James Bryan did, Booker T. Washington, Helen Keller, lots of well-known people. Gifford Pinchot were here to address the expositions they had here, which all had kind of a conservation sort of a theme. But this was the grandfather of all the buildings. Just such a gorgeous building. And you might ask, why isn't it still there? And the reason is that it was built of wood, and that was it was not marble as it looks from a distance. It was, and a lot of the buildings that were there over the years didn't last very long. It was, I should mention, in the later years, it was used to see some of our first big jazz concerts were in this building. Louis Armstrong performed there in 1935. The following year, a more amazing show was the Chick Webb, the Harlem band leader, who rarely toured and almost never toured the South, came here with his young singer Ella Fitzgerald to do a New Year's Eve show in this building in 1936. But it was kind of, people by this time were kind of complaining that, gosh, this is a fire hazard. It's just a tragedy waiting to happen. And there, it almost looks like it's on fire. This is just a picture of it at night. But it was used a lot for certain kinds of shows. But it was again, it was mostly built of wood, and it's very hard to maintain that. You had to keep it painted and keep it repaired on a regular basis. And it caught fire with just a spectacular blaze in 1938. I've seen pictures of it, and people could see it from a long distance. Just burned down completely. And believe it or not, a lot of people cheered that this took this liability off the city's hands. But then they built the Jacob Building right on the same site, and they built it of brick and stone. So it's not much less likely to go up in flames than this fantastic building as it is to look at today was. Would love to see someone try to rebuild that in stone and marble. But that's anyway, it's a lovely building. The only building on Chilhowee Park, by the way, that survives from that era is the old bandstand, which is still there from 1910. All right, we have some also rans. We're up at the top of the hour. Those are the seven. Those are my seven. They may not be your seven, but and they may not be my seven next week. But those are my seven wonders of ancient Knoxville. We have several also rans. I want to show you pictures of though. There's another picture of the house. One is the famous Market House on Market Square. It's hard to explain to tourists coming here that there used to be a giant Victorian building in the middle of the Market Square. But that's what it was. That was there in 1897. It hadn't been there in the early days of Market Square. Market Square had been more open, kind of like it is now, but with a small building at one end of it. And then at the other end too. But this was built in 1897. I think Cormac McCarthy described this as crazed and cupolaed and like nothing else in the annals of architecture, is how he described it in Suttree. But it was a great place. The ground floor had farmers' stalls. The upper floor had a public hall that held as many as 1,000 people. And everybody from Booker T. Washington to Carrie Nation to all sorts of people spoke to crowds up there. But the other end was the City Hall. So it was kind of like a two-headed caterpillar stretched across Market Square. It was torn down in 1960. A lot of people say it burned down. There had been a fire that damaged part of it, but it was considered fixable. It actually was just torn down. Originally, people thought about tearing down for parking, but they eventually made Market Square as a pedestrian mall was the big thing in the 1960s. All right, next one, please. All right, it occurred to me that a lot of the most remarkable works of architecture that are not there anymore are churches. A lot of churches have torn down their original church and rebuilt. This is the first, or an early version of First Methodist. I started to say the first Methodist. I think there might have been a church there before that. But this was on the corner of, I think, Locust and Clinch. Not too far from Church Street Methodist, which was a slightly different denomination. But a lovely church that was torn down a long time ago. First Methodist I mentioned earlier briefly is on Kingston Pike now. Next one. All right, this is kind of an offbeat, out of left field one here, and this is a drawing of odd things, as you might expect kids at UT 100 years ago to draw things. But this was not a pretty building. It never was a pretty building. People made fun of it from the day it was built. but a remarkable building. This was called Jefferson Hall. If you ever see references to Jefferson Hall, you might picture a more grand, stately building than this. It was built again. It was a building built entirely of wood. It was built for one purpose in 1903, I think, and that was to entertain. It was originally built in the quad on the top of the hill. It was built to entertain people who attended the Summer School of the South, which was a giant convention of teachers from all over the South who would see all sorts of, hear about all sorts of new ideas, new music, new drama, and all these things would be happening in this building. And I want to just mention some of the people who were in this building performing. A lot of famous Broadway stars were there. Carl Sandburg, the poet, was there perhaps more than once. Violinist Albert Spaulding performed there several times. Charles Coburn, the later Hollywood actor, became very familiar with that building. He performed there a lot. Jane Addams, their reformer, was there. William Jennings Bryan, lots of people. It became kind of central to this summer thing. But after the summer thing was over, it was still there, and people at UT with the big stately collegiate buildings around it said, "Gosh, what are we going to do with this thing?" And they realized UT had a lot of uses for it, because UT didn't have an auditorium at the time, and UT began using this for speeches, for dances, for all sorts of things, and eventually decided it was undignified to have it in the original place, so they actually moved it somehow down the hill after they had moved the football field away to where it is now. They moved it down the hill near the corner of Cumberland and what's now Fulton. So that was where it was for several years in the 1920s and 30s before it burned down. And unfortunately, it was being used as a munitions depot by the National Guard at the time. It caught fire in 1935 and went up with a spectacular series of fireworks. People thought it was a planned fireworks display and came from all around us to just witness it, not knowing that this was actual real munitions going off, and they could have been hit by some kind of ordnance. But anyway, just I wanted to throw this in just as kind of a curveball. But this is Jefferson Hall, which might be legendary if it were prettier. And here's the old another auditorium downtown. This is this Quonset hut style auditorium. This was our first municipal auditorium, built about 60 years before we built the Civic Auditorium. And this was a city project that turned out not to be financially feasible, but it was there for several years. Built in the very early 1900s. If you recognize the building, if the building in the background on the right looks familiar, there's a reason for that. That is the side of the Bijou Theater, also known as Lamar House, the old part of it there. So that's the Bijou's already there in that picture. So this is after 1909, apparently. So, but this was they tried to use it as a skating rink for a time. But this is in 1910. When it was decked out for a visit from a very famous visitor who was extremely popular here. So they had to have the biggest room in town for him, and his name was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt really brought out the crowds, and surprisingly, I think the only time that Knoxville ever voted for the most liberal guy running for president was in 1912, when it was Teddy Roosevelt running on the Bull Moose ticket, when he was actually promoting universal health care at the time. But anyway, Roosevelt was extremely popular, conservationist. He was here several times. He had been at the Appalachian Exposition. He'd been all over the place, but he came out here and actually talked about. He said, "I see John Severa's grave up there," and gestured to it, and talked about learning about John Severa as a young boy up north. But anyway, it's an amazing building. It was for a while a skating rink. After that, it failed as an auditorium to make its living. They tried it as a skating rink where they would actually show movies while you were skating, silent movies. While you were skating inside here. And later on was relegated to serve as a streetcar barn. It was where we kept the streetcars when we weren't using them for many years. and was torn down in the very early 50s. There's actually film of it being torn down. Next one, please. All right, here's a building a lot of people are surprised to see. This is the old Union Terminal building, which was built, I think, about 1929. And if you have a copy of the Knoxville Sessions, that great box set put out by the Bear family about the sessions that were made on the Wall Avenue at the St. James Hotel, this building, this scene is right in the background. It's just a lovely deco modern, stylish 1920s, 30s style building. That was the terminal for the bus. The different bus lines would come together here. Interstate bus lines you would go there, and they had an arcade, like a little mall inside where you could shop, get your haircut, whatever you wanted inside there. There are lots of references to this building in Cormac McCarthy's novel Suttree, and it's one of the things that really throws people off when he talks about the Union Arcade, that Suttree and his chums, because it's free to walk through there, they walk through there a lot. But this is right at the corner of Gay and Wall Avenue. But it was torn down, I think, about 1960 or so, and it's still just a gap now today. And I think they're beginning to redevelop it for the first time since then. Next one, please. All right, this is something we have references to in the Bearden book. We don't have this picture because we didn't know about it, but this is the Dixie Memorial Highway, also known as the Road of Remembrance. This was a poignant gesture. This is Kingston Pike. And this was a poignant gesture in 1925 to remember the soldiers of World War I from East Tennessee who died in the war with trees. And each soldier would have a tree with his name on it. And they planted trees for all the hundreds of soldiers from East Tennessee who were killed in the war, and up and down this road of remembrance. And Alvin York, Sergeant York, came here to speak about it. It had a big rollout for it, but within a couple of years, it had kind of been forgotten about. And it was during this time that there was a lot of development pressure on Kingston Pike, because there were thousands of people driving down Kingston Pike every day, going from Chicago to Miami or wherever, from Washington to New Orleans. There were all these people came together in Knoxville in this 20-mile stretch of Kingston Pike that became known as the Dixie Lee Highway to some people. But this was where there were lots of motels, lots of snack shops, lots of trinket shops, lots of nightclubs up and down the street. We tell the story in our historic Bearden book about what happened to this, and also the whole history of the tourist business down here. But these big monuments on either side of the street, we don't have any idea what happened to them. They just disappeared at some point. There were apparently 4 of them, 2 at each end of this memorial part of the highway, which apparently began. We're not exactly sure where this picture was taken, but it began over near, not far from where I guess where Lions View comes into Kingston Pike. It was within sight of there, at least. So it was a very beautiful idea that I think may have been naive, but apparently they widened the road, and I probably took out all these trees that were planted for these soldiers, and you just stop seeing it mentioned. You see one little mention in 1931 that's not being taken care of anymore, and then there's not another mention of it that I've found after that. If anybody knows anything about this, let us know. Next one. All right, here's we're going to talk about this next time, but I just want to mention this is the fort that fended off a major Confederate charge in 1863, and was a tourist destination in Knoxville for quite a long time. People would come here to go to Fort Sanders, especially the men in the 1890 Blue and Gray reunion, and a lot of them. You might have noticed earlier we had an ad directed to them for the Vendome. Some of them stayed at the Vendome in 1890, which was brand new then. But they actually camped here, and they had fireworks displays here. Both a reunion of Union and Confederate soldiers who had been trying to kill each other in 1863 got together as older men and just had a big party here on the fort site. The fort just vanished by degrees, and I'm not sure what the Faulkner's theory about this is, but I've tried to interview people and figured that the last remnant of the fort to disappear was probably around 1920. James Agee remembered the ruins of the fort and mentions them in his book *A Death in the Family*. But I think the last of them were redeveloped away in the 20s, around 17th, 18th Street. All right, next one, please.
This is the last one.
Yeah. All right, I couldn't talk about wonders of ancient Knoxville without talking about this bizarre story that nobody can believe. This is the cable car, and this was a cable car that went up to the top of the bluff across the river from the UT Ag campus, what's now the UT Ag campus, which was not that yet at that time. But in 1894, they built this thing, and it got a write-up in Scientific American. It was quite an amazing thing for any city to do, to send people up across this expansive river in this little car to go up to this new park that was being planned, possibly to tie all these things together. It was possibly being planned by Frederick Olmsted when he was here in the early 1890s. But this was the cable car. It ran happily for a few months until 1894, when there was an accident, and it may have been a matter of sabotage, perhaps just a prank that went terribly wrong. But they believe that this pulling cord had been tampered with and snapped, and it slid. It didn't fall, but it slid back down and tangled up and jolted to a stop above the river, where they couldn't even move it one way or the other. One young lawyer was killed in that accident, and several people were injured. And it actually took were actually rescued from what they called a steam yacht, and there was actually an African American guy that was kind of the hero of the situation, who threw up was able to threw up a rope to the thing, and in such a way that he could hoist himself up to the cable car and lower the people down into this what they called a steam yacht, a motor powered boat beneath them. But this was just kind of just an astonishing thing. But yeah, to tie it all back around, this this might have been this park that they were planning and never finished. I think because it all aligned with the Panic of 1893, which was the worst depression we've had before the Great Depression, 1893-94. That we just ran out of money for this park that we were planning, and never got completed up there. But it's possible that Olmsted was involved in that. All right, we've gone through quite a lot in hour and change. But if there are any questions or suggestions, we're done. We're happy to stay and talk to anybody who wants to stay. But